Hey, hope all is well, and I hope your week is going smoothly. So today we're going to talk about what to do when things don't work. So whenever we're talking about improving skills or coaching in general, sometimes things just don't work like we expect they should. We have a plan that makes sense, we have a solution that would work, and it just doesn't. So what do we do about it? And that's literally the question I received, which is what do you do when things don't work? So first of all, let's assume that swimmers are trying and they're putting in the effort they need to be successful. If they're not, that's a much bigger and a much different problem that we're not going to be tackling today. So if swimmers are putting in the effort and it's still not working, the bottom line is almost always that the set is too hard in some way. And so to get the result you want, you got to take a step back. And saying it's too hard doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what to do because it can be too hard in a lot of different ways. And that's what we're going to talk about and explore so that you can have a bunch of different solutions to try to figure out when it's not going well, what you need to do to get it back on track. So there are two primary issues that you need to be aware of. First, you could be doing the wrong activity. You could be doing an activity that's not right for them right now, or you could be doing the right activity, but in the wrong context. In that case, you're doing things that they can be successful with, but you're doing them in a way that's not allowing them to be successful. So let's tackle context first because it's a little bit easier to understand and it's a little bit easier to manage. And if this ends up being your problem, it's usually pretty simple to solve it. So when there's an issue with context, what I mean by that is that the set is designed in a way that doesn't set swimmers up for success and it doesn't allow them to do what you ask them to do. So for instance, the distances could be too long, the speeds could be too high, the rest periods could be too short, and the overall volume might be too large. If any of these things are the case, they're not going to be able to do the things that you ask. And when I say that the volume is too high or the speed's too high, it's relative to what you're asking them to do. So if you're asking them to swim at 200-meter pace, but you're only allowing them to take 4 strokes a lap or something like that, that's probably not going to happen. And so there's nothing necessarily wrong with asking them to swim at 200 pace, but if you want them to take 4 strokes in a lap, then they're not going to be able to do that. And so that's an issue where what you're asking them to do, the context is inappropriate. You're asking them to go too fast for what you want them to do. So for them to be successful, they have to be fresh enough, they have to be recovered enough to do whatever you're asking them to do. And if something's pretty hard and something's pretty challenging, they're going to need to be relatively fresh. So if they're struggling to do what you're asking them to do, one of those 4 variables might be off. And usually if you change 1 or 2 of them, it'll help get them back on track. And so if you're having a problem with them being successful, it's just not working, that might be the solution that you need to implement. You just have to change the set and change how you're doing the set, and that'll get them back on track. If that's the case, it's usually a pretty simple fix, and you can just do that right away. Another potential issue is that what you're actually asking them to do is too difficult. So you're asking them to perform an activity, you're asking them to perform a drill, you're asking them to perform something that they just don't have the skills to do right now. So you could be asking them to swim a certain drill or a certain skill, and there's just too much resistance. So for instance, if you're asking them to kick vertical, kick and streamline, and they have a really heavy weight, and they just don't have the skill or the strength or the ability to kick strong enough in order to stay afloat, well, then they're never going to be able to be successful, even if you give them enough rest and don't ask them to do it for very long. Similarly, if you're using training aids that are too difficult to manage for the swimmers for that skill, so for instance, if they're doing some freestyle and they're using a band and it's just too difficult for them to manage whatever you're asking them to do, the band is going to be the problem and it's going to make it a lot more difficult to say, take 8 strokes a lap with a band. Some of them just won't be able to do that because the band prohibits them from executing that skill. Another issue may be that there are too many different aspects of the set that you're asking them to do at once. So you could be asking them to descend, negative split, build, and hit a certain stroke count all within the same repetition. And that can be really difficult for swimmers to manage all of those different pieces, and it's just beyond their ability to do so. And finally, they may just not be able to do the drill you're asking them to do. And so for instance, we'll use this as an example a little bit later on, but if they're doing paddle cap freestyle where they swim with the paddle on their head, some swimmers really struggle to make that happen right away. And so if you're asking them to do full 25s with a certain breathing pattern, they just might not have the skill set to do that yet because their breathing simply isn't good enough to even get close to being able to do that drill. And so that's a problem that needs to be managed as well. And when that's the case, you got to figure out a different way to work on that skill because whatever you're trying to do, they're not ready to do yet. So when you run into these kind of problems, with the resistance, you just drop the resistance or you drop whatever training aid that you're using that's making it too difficult. And if the set's too complicated, they're trying to do too many different things at the same time, just simplify the set, ask them to do 1 or 2 things instead of 3 or 4. And lastly, if they just can't manage the drill, use a simpler version of the drill or use a different drill that addresses the same skill that you're working on. So let's make this a little bit more concrete. So let's say they're going 10-25s paddle cap freestyle. They have to breathe every 3 and it's as fast as possible and they only get 10 seconds rest between repetitions. So let's say they're really struggling with that. So the first thing you could do is you could reduce the number of repetitions. Take it down to 4 or maybe 6 at a time. Suddenly that might be manageable. They may just start falling apart the second half of the set. The other thing you could do is just give them more rest. It'll allow them to recover. It'll allow them to regroup. It'll allow them to manage each repetition a little bit better. So you go from 10 seconds rest to maybe 30 seconds rest. And all of a sudden, the problem might be solved. You could also slow them down. And so instead of telling them to go fast as possible, you just tell them to go as smooth as possible, or you tell them to go a steady effort or even a strong effort, but just not all out. That alone might make the difference. And then the last thing you could do is instead of having them breathe every 3, which is pretty tough to do with paddle cap freestyle because they've got to go both ways and at speed, you can just simplify the breathing pattern to whatever you want, to breathe every 2, breathe every 4, something that's easier for them to manage. And those changes alone might help them get back on track. And when you're making your decision, you have to give preference to one of the different attributes of the set. So if you want them to keep swimming fast, then just reduce the volume and give them more rest. If you want to keep the volume up, simply reduce the speed and give them more rest. If you want to keep the rest period short, you might want to lower the volume and you might want to have them slow down. And that way you get to accomplish what you want, but you've made it easier in another way. And it could also be the activity itself. And so they may just really struggle with paddle cap freestyle. If that's the case, rather than have them worry about breathing, just have them swim with the paddle and not breathe. That's an easier version of paddle cap freestyle because they're keeping the head still because with the paddle, but they don't have to worry about breathing. So first, make sure that they can do that really well. Now, even sometimes that might not work. And so then you can go backwards and then you could just have them kick with a paddle on their head. So there's less going on. There's no rotation. There's no arms. They're just kicking. And then they can just focus on keeping the head still. And when they're successful with that, you can add the arms back in. So wherever they're at, once they start having success, you can work your way back up to normal paddle cap freestyle. And again, that might not be something you can do in one workout. It may be, but it might take a couple exposures before they get the hang of it. And so if you just stay with paddle cap freestyle, they're always going to struggle because they don't have the skills to make it work. So you have to choose an earlier version and an easier version so that they can build the skills to work up to the drill you ultimately want them to do. It's also possible that their breathing is so bad, they may lack foundational skills necessary in order to execute the drill correctly. For instance, they may struggle with their body position and they may need to work on some floating exercises to get that locked in. Or they may struggle with their ability to breathe rhythmically. In that case, some bobbing can be really helpful. You fix those foundational skills, and again, then you go back to paddle cap freestyle. It's all about working backwards, problem solving, getting them to be successful, and then building upon that success. And while we use the context of paddle cap freestyle here, the same idea applies for any drill or any skill that you're working on. So if things just aren't working, here's the checklist you can use to get things back on track. First of all, is the context holding them back? Are they trying to swim too fast? Are they trying to do it when they're too tired? Next, is the activity the appropriate one? Can they do it correctly in any context? If not, what's a simpler version of the drill or the skill? You just work backwards until they're successful, and once they're successful, you start working up back towards the drill. And if they're lacking something foundational, you need to address that first. So for instance, if you're asking them to do stroke counts during pace work, but they've never done any sort of stroke counting before, they need to learn the foundational skill of counting their strokes at slower speeds before they can start doing it during pace work. Fix the foundation, and then you can go back to the activity that you ultimately want to do. So this checklist and this process might not give you the answer of what to do. So this checklist might not tell you exactly what you need to do, but it'll give you a process and a framework for figuring out the answer to the problem that you're facing. As a coach, you're going to consistently run into the issue where things just don't work. You have to have a process, you have to have a framework for making that happen, and when you do, it makes life a lot easier because you can problem solve, get back on track, and then you can avoid that problem in the future because you know what to look for and you know how to solve it. Hope that was helpful, and as always, keep it simple.